The notification sound from my laptop made my stomach drop. Another donation to Madison's GoFundMe campaign. This one for $300 from someone named Patricia Chen in Oregon. A complete stranger, moved to tears by a story that wasn't hers to tell. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling as I scrolled through comment after comment of support, love, and shared grief, all directed toward my sister-in-law, Madison Harper, who had somehow turned my most devastating personal moments into her profitable online performance. The pregnancy I lost at 22 weeks wasn't just my tragedy anymore. It had become her business model.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Reese White, and 3 months ago, I thought I knew exactly who the people in my life were. I was 26, working as a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, married to my college sweetheart Jake for 2 years, and living in a cozy apartment in Fishtown that we decorated with plants and dreams of filling the extra bedroom with a crib. The miscarriage happened on a Tuesday in March. I remember because I was supposed to work the evening shift, but instead found myself in the emergency room at Jefferson Hospital, Jake's hand crushing mine as Dr. Patricia Moreau delivered news that shattered our carefully constructed future. At 22 weeks, we had already picked out names. Sophia Rose White. We had her nursery half-painted in soft yellow because we wanted to be surprised. The medical terminology felt clinical and cold against the magnitude of what we were losing. Late-term pregnancy loss, incompetent cervix, fetal demise. Each phrase landed like a physical blow, reducing our daughter to a series of medical failures that somehow felt like my fault, even though Dr. Moreau assured me repeatedly that nothing I had done caused this. Jake took a week off from his job at the architectural firm downtown. I took 3 weeks of bereavement leave, which felt both too long and nowhere near enough time to process what had happened to us. The hospital was understanding. They'd seen too many nurses go through similar losses. But returning to work meant facing the pediatric wing every day, surrounded by the sounds of children who got to grow up when mine didn't. That's when I found the support group. Harbor Light Community Center in Northern Liberties hosted a weekly gathering for women who had experienced pregnancy loss. The facilitator, Dr. Susan Martinez, was a licensed therapist who specialized in reproductive grief. The first time I walked into that circle of folding chairs in the basement meeting room, I felt like I could finally breathe again. There were 8 of us that first night. Angela, a lawyer from Center City who had lost twins at 19 weeks. Carmen, a teacher from South Philly whose daughter was stillborn at full term. Michelle, who worked at the free library and had experienced 3 consecutive miscarriages. Janet, a social worker who lost her son at 25 weeks due to a cord accident, and others whose stories became woven into my own healing process over the following months. We met every Thursday at 7 p.m. The ritual became sacred to me. Leaving work, stopping at Wawa for a coffee, driving the familiar route down Spring Garden Street, parking in the small lot behind the community center. Dr. Martinez always had tissues ready and spoke in gentle tones that never felt patronizing. She encouraged us to share as much or as little as we wanted, and somehow in that circle, the clinical language transformed back into human experience. I talked about Sophia, how I felt her first kicks during a busy shift at the hospital, and had to excuse myself to cry in the supply closet, not from sadness, but from pure joy. How Jake and I would lie in bed with his hand on my belly, making plans for Saturday morning pancakes and family camping trips. How I had started reading to her every night, believing somehow that she could hear my voice through the layers of skin and muscle and fluid that separated us. The other women understood in ways that well-meaning friends and family couldn't. They didn't tell me everything happens for a reason or that I was young and could try again. They just listened when I talked about the phantom kicks I still felt months later, or when I cried about seeing pregnant women at the grocery store.
By June, our group had become a lifeline. We had each other's phone numbers and had started meeting for coffee outside of the official sessions. Angela organized a memorial service where we planted a garden behind the community center, 8 small trees for the children we'd lost. Carmen brought homemade tres leches cake to every meeting because she said sugar helped process grief. Michelle created a private Facebook group where we could share resources and check in between meetings. It was Michelle who first mentioned the importance of privacy and trust within our group. She was the one who reminded us that what we shared in that basement room stayed in that basement room. The stories we told, the details we revealed about our losses, our partners, our families, all of it was sacred ground that deserved protection. I felt safe there in ways I hadn't felt safe anywhere else since losing Sophia. Safe enough to talk about the guilt I carried, wondering if working long shifts on my feet had somehow caused the cervical weakness that led to early labor. Safe enough to admit that I was angry at other women who got to complain about morning sickness and swollen feet when I would have given anything to experience those discomforts for 37 more weeks. Safe enough to say that sometimes I resented Jake for being able to compartmentalize his grief and return to normal life while I felt stuck in an endless loop of what-ifs and if-onlys.
The group had strict guidelines about confidentiality, which Dr. Martinez reviewed at the beginning of each session. We didn't use last names unless someone specifically chose to share theirs. We didn't take photos during meetings. We didn't discuss specific details about other member stories outside the group, and we certainly didn't share anyone's personal information or experiences on social media or in any public forum without explicit consent. These weren't arbitrary rules. Dr. Martinez explained that many women who experienced pregnancy loss felt vulnerable and exposed, especially in a culture that often treated miscarriage and stillbirth as taboo subjects that should be processed privately and quickly. The support group functioned as a protected space where we could be honest about our experiences without worrying about judgment, unwanted advice, or having our pain minimized or exploited. I had been attending regularly for 3 months when Madison entered our lives in a more significant way. Madison Harper had been Jake's older brother Ryan's girlfriend for about a year when we lost Sophia. I didn't know her well. We'd met at a few family gatherings, exchanged pleasantries at Ryan's birthday party, made small talk on Sunday dinners at Jake's parents' house in Monayunk. She seemed nice enough, though something about her always felt slightly performative to me. She had a way of steering conversations toward herself, of finding ways to make other people's experiences relate back to her own struggles or achievements. Ryan was smitten, though. He was 31 and had been single for most of his 20s, focused on building his career in pharmaceutical sales. Madison was 29, worked in social media marketing for a boutique firm in Rittenhouse Square, and had the kind of polished Instagram presence that made everything in her life look effortlessly curated. She posted daily, coffee cups with inspirational quotes, workout photos from her CrossFit gym, carefully arranged flat lays of books and candles and succulents. When Jake and I were going through the acute phase of grief in March and April, Madison had been appropriately sympathetic. She sent a flower arrangement to the funeral home where we held Sophia's memorial service. She hugged me at family dinners and asked how I was doing in the gentle, slightly uncomfortable way that people do when they're not sure how to navigate someone else's loss. But as spring turned to summer, I noticed that Madison seemed unusually interested in the details of my grief process. She would ask specific questions about the support group, what we talked about, how the other women were coping, whether I felt like it was helping. At first, I appreciated what seemed like genuine concern. I told her about Dr. Martinez's approach, about how meaningful it was to connect with other women who understood the specific pain of pregnancy loss. Madison would nod thoughtfully and ask follow-up questions. Had any of the other women lost babies as late in pregnancy as I had? What kinds of medical complications had they experienced? How were their partners handling the grief? Did we talk about trying to get pregnant again? The questions felt intrusive, but I attributed that to Madison's background in social media marketing. She was probably just naturally curious about human stories and emotional experiences in ways that related to her professional work.
And besides, she was going to be my sister-in-law soon. Ryan had started making noises about proposing, and Madison had not so subtly started following wedding planning accounts on Instagram. I answered her questions in general terms, being careful not to violate the confidentiality of other group members, but sharing enough about my own experience to satisfy what seemed like caring interest. I told her about the memorial garden we'd planted, about how meaningful it was to have a physical space to honor Sophia's memory. I mentioned that several of the women had started working with fertility specialists to address underlying medical issues before trying to conceive again. I shared that the group had helped me understand that grief doesn't follow a timeline and that healing isn't linear. Madison absorbed all of this information with the kind of focused attention that should have felt supportive, but somehow left me feeling drained after our conversations. It wasn't until early July that I began to understand why.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The discovery happened by accident, which somehow made it feel even more like a betrayal. I was sitting in the break room at Children's Hospital on a humid Thursday afternoon in early July, scrolling through Facebook during my 15-minute break between patient rounds. The pediatric ward had been particularly challenging that week. We had a 7-year-old with leukemia whose parents were struggling with treatment decisions, and a premature baby whose twin hadn't survived delivery. Days like these reminded me why the support group had become so essential to my mental health. A sponsored post appeared in my feed, the kind of targeted advertisement that Facebook's algorithm generates based on your browsing history and personal information. Help Madison fight her battle, with a professional-looking photo of a woman I recognized immediately, Madison Harper, my soon-to-be sister-in-law, smiling softly at the camera with her hand placed protectively over what appeared to be a small baby bump. My coffee went cold in my hands as I clicked on the link. The GoFundMe page loaded slowly on the hospital's Wi-Fi, each element appearing piece by piece like a puzzle I didn't want to solve. The main image showed Madison in what looked like a hospital gown, though something about the lighting seemed off, too bright and staged for an actual medical facility. The campaign title read, "Support Madison through devastating pregnancy loss and medical bills." The description that followed made my blood run cold. "Hi everyone, my name is Madison Harper, and I'm reaching out during the most difficult time of my life. 3 months ago, my partner Ryan and I received the devastating news that our daughter, Emma Rose, had stopped growing at 22 weeks due to complications with my cervix. Despite the best efforts of the medical team at Jefferson Hospital, we lost our precious baby girl on March 15th. I read the date 3 times. March 15th was the exact day I had lost Sophia. The story continued with details that felt sickeningly familiar. Madison described the incompetent cervix diagnosis, the emergency trip to Jefferson Hospital, the heartbreak of losing a daughter they had already named and loved. She wrote about the painted nursery, the tiny clothes they had started collecting, the dreams that died with their baby. But these weren't Madison's experiences. These were mine. She had lifted entire paragraphs of emotional content directly from conversations we'd had at family dinners, descriptions I'd shared about my own loss and grief. The painted yellow nursery, that was Sophia's room. The name Emma Rose was clearly adapted from Sophia Rose. Even the specific medical terminology about cervical incompetence came from my own medical records and the information I'd shared with family members. The fundraising goal was set to $25,000, with over $8,000 already raised from 43 donors. Each contribution came with a comment expressing sympathy, sharing similar experiences, or offering prayers for Madison's healing. Reading through them felt like watching strangers mourn my daughter while sending money to someone who had never experienced the loss she was claiming. Praying for peace and healing during this impossible time. Jennifer L., $100. I lost my son at 24 weeks 5 years ago. The pain never fully goes away, but it does get easier to carry. Sending love. Sarah M., $250. No parent should have to go through this. Wishing you strength as you navigate this journey. Michael K., $50.
The medical bills section of Madison's campaign described mounting costs from the hospital stay, specialized procedures, and ongoing therapy to process the trauma. She claimed that her insurance had denied coverage for certain aspects of the loss, leaving them with unexpected financial burden during an already devastating time. But I knew Madison's insurance situation. Ryan had mentioned several times that his pharmaceutical company provided excellent health benefits, and Madison had supplemental coverage through her marketing firm. The financial hardship angle was as fabricated as the pregnancy itself. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through the campaign updates Madison had posted over the past 3 months. She had been documenting a grief journey that mirrored my own with unsettling precision, posting about support group meetings she claimed to attend, memorial activities that sounded suspiciously similar to our tree planting ceremony, and emotional milestones that corresponded exactly to my own healing timeline. In one update from May, Madison wrote about joining a support group for women who had experienced pregnancy loss. She described the basement meeting room, the circle of folding chairs, the gentle facilitator who specialized in reproductive grief. She even mentioned specific details about other women's stories: Angela's twins, Carmen's full-term loss, Michelle's multiple miscarriages, all shared without names but with enough identifying information that anyone from our actual group would recognize their experiences being exploited.
The most recent update, posted just 4 days earlier, described Madison's decision to try getting pregnant again with the support of a fertility specialist. She wrote about the complex emotions around moving forward, the fear of another loss, and the hope that felt almost too fragile to acknowledge. These were thoughts I had shared with a support group just 2 weeks prior, during a particularly emotional session where Dr. Martinez had guided us through discussions about readiness for future pregnancies. I took screenshots of everything: the main campaign page, the donation comments, each update Madison had posted. My nursing training had taught me to document carefully when something didn't add up, and every instinct I had was screaming that this entire fundraiser was built on stolen experiences and fabricated circumstances. But documenting the evidence was easier than processing the emotional impact of what I was seeing. Madison hadn't just lied to strangers on the internet for money. She had taken the most painful experience of my life and turned it into performance art for profit. She had stolen not just my story, but the stories of vulnerable women who had trusted our support group with their most intimate losses. The violation felt deeper than simple fraud. She had appropriated grief itself, turning authentic trauma into content designed to manipulate people's compassion and generosity. Every dollar donated to her campaign represented someone who believed they were supporting a woman through genuine loss, when in reality, they were funding an elaborate deception. I closed the Facebook app and sat staring at my phone's black screen, trying to process what I had just discovered. The pediatric ward continued its normal rhythm around me: nurses updating charts, families visiting patients, the constant background hum of medical equipment monitoring small lives. But I felt completely disconnected from the familiar environment, as if Madison's betrayal had shifted the ground beneath everything I thought I knew about the people in my life. The questions came in rapid succession. How long had she been planning this? Had her interest in my support group always been research for this scam? Did Ryan know what she was doing? How many other details from our family conversations had she harvested for her fictional narrative? And perhaps most disturbing, if she was willing to exploit pregnancy loss for money, what else was she lying about? I thought about the 43 people who had donated to Madison's campaign, believing they were helping someone through genuine tragedy. I thought about the women in my support group whose private stories had been repackaged and sold to strangers without their knowledge or consent. I thought about Dr. Martinez's careful emphasis on confidentiality and sacred space, principles that Madison had violated for financial gain. My 15-minute break was over, but I couldn't bring myself to return to patient rounds. I called my supervisor and explained that I was having a family emergency and needed to leave early.
It wasn't entirely untrue. Discovering that a family member was committing fraud using your personal trauma qualified as an emergency in any reasonable interpretation. I drove home to our Fishtown apartment in a daze, Madison's fabricated story playing on repeat in my mind. Jake wouldn't be home from work for another 3 hours, which gave me time to figure out how to explain what I had discovered and what we needed to do about it. Because one thing was already clear, this couldn't continue. Madison was actively defrauding people using stolen experiences, violating the privacy of vulnerable women, and profiting from a tragedy that belonged to our family. The campaign had been running for 3 months and was gaining momentum, which meant more people were being scammed every day. But confronting Madison would require careful planning. She had demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of emotional manipulation and online fundraising. Simply accusing her of fraud might prompt her to delete the campaign and disappear with the money she had already collected, leaving the donors with no recourse and no closure. I needed to gather more evidence, understand the full scope of her deception, and figure out the best way to stop her while protecting both the people she was scamming and the women's stories she had stolen. The awakening moment had passed. Now it was time to figure out how to fight back.
Jake found me sitting at our kitchen table at 6:30 that evening, surrounded by printed screenshots and handwritten notes like a detective building a case. I had spent the afternoon documenting everything I could find about Madison's campaign, cross-referencing her posts with my own memories and the timeline of our support group meetings. "Reese, what's all this?" He set down his messenger bag and loosened his tie, the familiar ritual of transitioning from architect to husband, momentarily suspended by the chaos spread across our dining space. I handed him the printed GoFundMe page without saying anything. Sometimes the evidence speaks more clearly than any explanation you could provide. I watched Jake's face change as he read Madison's fabricated story. Confusion first, then recognition, then a flash of anger that made his jaw tighten in a way I recognized from our worst arguments. He set the paper down carefully, as if it might explode. "She's using Sophia's story." His voice was flat, controlled in the way that meant he was furious, but trying to process before reacting. "Not just Sophia's story. She's using details from my support group, personal information from our family conversations, even the specific medical terminology from my records." I showed him the timeline I had created, matching Madison's campaign updates with real events from our lives. "Look at the dates, Jake. She posted about joining a support group the day after I told her about Dr. Martinez. She described the memorial garden 3 days after I showed her photos from our tree planting ceremony." Jake read through my documentation methodically, his architect's mind organizing the information into clear patterns of deception. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and ran his hands through his hair, a gesture that had become more frequent since we lost Sophia. "This is... I don't even know what to call this. Identity theft? Fraud? Emotional abuse?" He looked at me with the same protective intensity he had shown in the hospital 3 months earlier. "How long has she been doing this?" "The campaign started in April, about 3 weeks after I lost Sophia, but I think she's been gathering information since March, maybe even before that." I pulled out my phone and showed him Madison's Instagram posts from the past several months. "Look at this pattern. She's been photographing herself in what look like medical settings, posting about difficult appointments and challenging news without giving specifics. I think she's been building the foundation for this story for months." We spent the next hour going through everything together, Jake asking questions that helped me see details I had missed. He pointed out that several of Madison's photos appeared to be taken at different locations than she claimed. The hospital room image looked more like a staged photo shoot, and the medical consultation pictures seemed to be from routine appointments rather than pregnancy-related visits. "The question is, what do we do about it?" Jake leaned back in his chair, looking at me with the steady gaze that had first attracted to me in college. "We need to find out if there's a pattern," I said. If she's done this before, there might be other victims, other campaigns, other families whose stories she's stolen. Jake pulled out his laptop and we began researching Madison's online presence more thoroughly than either of us had ever thought to do before. Her Instagram account went back 3 years, showcasing a carefully curated life of fitness achievements, career milestones, and relationship highlights with Ryan. But when we looked closer, gaps in the timeline became apparent. There was a 6-month period in 2022 where Madison had posted very little, claiming to be taking a social media break for mental health. Her LinkedIn profile showed employment at 3 different marketing firms over the past 4 years, which could indicate ambition and growth, or problematic behavior that resulted in frequent job changes. Most significantly, we found traces of deleted social media accounts and fundraising campaigns that Madison had scrubbed from her online history, but that still appeared in cached search results. A cancer awareness fundraiser from 2021 that had been removed from multiple platforms. A dog rescue campaign from 2020 that no longer existed. References to family medical emergencies and financial hardships that seemed to appear and disappear from her social media presence in patterns that suggested strategic deployment rather than authentic life experiences. "She's done this before," Jake said, staring at the search results on his screen. "Multiple times. We're not dealing with someone who made a desperate mistake. We're dealing with someone who has a system." The realization shifted our decision from a family crisis to a moral imperative. Madison wasn't just exploiting my personal tragedy, she was operating what appeared to be an ongoing fraud scheme that targeted people's compassion and generosity. The donors to her current campaign were just the latest victims in what might be years of similar scams. "I want to talk to Dr. Martinez," I said. "I need to let her know that our group's confidentiality has been violated, and I want her advice on how to protect the other women. And I think we need to document everything before we take any action," Jake added. "If Madison realizes we're onto her, she might delete the campaign and disappear. We need to preserve the evidence." We spent the rest of the evening creating a comprehensive file of Madison's deception. Jake used his architect's attention to detail to create a timeline that cross-referenced her posts with real events in our lives. I wrote detailed accounts of every conversation where I had shared information that later appeared in her campaign. We saved screenshots of everything, including cached versions of her deleted campaigns and social media posts. By 10 p.m., we had built a case that clearly demonstrated Madison's pattern of fraud and manipulation. But we also had a decision to make about how to proceed. "If we report her to the authorities, Ryan will be devastated," Jake said, voicing the concern that had underlined our entire investigation. "If we don't report her, she'll keep victimizing other people. And honestly, Jake, I think Ryan deserves to know who he's planning to marry. What if she's scamming him too? What if she's using his money, his connections, his trust to fund these campaigns?" The decision felt enormous, but it was also becoming clearer. Madison's fraud went beyond stealing my story. She was systematically exploiting human compassion for profit, violating the trust of vulnerable people who believed they were supporting someone through genuine crisis. The women in my support group, the donors to her campaign, Ryan himself, everyone in Madison's orbit was at risk of being manipulated and exploited. "We turn her in," Jake said, finally. "To GoFundMe, to the police, to whoever will investigate this properly. And we tell Ryan before he hears it from someone else." I nodded, feeling the weight and relief of a difficult decision made with integrity rather than convenience. Tomorrow morning, I'll call Dr. Martinez and schedule an emergency session with the support group. They need to know what happened and decide for themselves whether they want to pursue any action. And I'll call Ryan and ask him to meet us for coffee. He deserves to hear this from family, not from a police investigation. We went to bed that night knowing our lives were about to change dramatically. Madison's fraud had forced us into a situation where every choice would have significant consequences, but doing nothing would have been the worst choice of all. The decision was made. Now we had to live with whatever came next.
Friday morning arrived with the kind of clarity that only comes after making a difficult decision.
I called in sick to work for the first time since returning from bereavement leave, knowing that what we were about to set in motion would require my full attention and emotional energy. Dr. Martinez answered her office phone on the second ring, her familiar voice immediately offering the calm presence I had come to associate with healing and safety. "Reese, is everything all right? You sound distressed." "Dr. Martinez, I need to schedule an emergency group session. Something has happened that affects all of us, and I think the women need to know about it as soon as possible." There was a pause. In the 3 months I had been attending sessions, I had never requested emergency meetings or expressed urgency about group business outside our Thursday evening schedule. "Can you tell me what's happened?" I took a deep breath and explained the situation as clearly as I could. Madison's fraudulent campaign, the stolen stories from our group sessions, the violation of our confidentiality agreement, and the evidence Jake and I had gathered about her pattern of similar scams. Dr. Martinez listened without interrupting, occasionally making soft sounds of concern or disbelief. "This is a serious breach of trust and privacy," she said when I finished. "And you're right that the group members need to be informed immediately. Some of them may want to pursue legal action, and all of them deserve to know that their stories have been exploited without consent." We scheduled an emergency session for Saturday afternoon at 2 p.m. Dr. Martinez would contact each member individually to explain the general situation and ask them to attend if possible. She emphasized that participation would be voluntary, but that the information I needed to share affected everyone's privacy and safety. "Reese, I want you to know that you're doing the right thing by bringing this forward," Dr. Martinez said before we hung up. "It takes courage to expose this kind of violation, especially when it involves family relationships. The group will support you through this process." After the call, I sat in our kitchen staring at my phone, gathering the emotional strength for the next conversation. Jake had left for work with a plan to call Ryan around lunchtime and ask him to meet us for coffee at La Colombe in Fishtown at 4 p.m. We had decided to wait until after my group meeting so I could give Ryan complete information about how Madison's girlfriend's actions had affected multiple women, not just me. But first, I needed to file reports with the appropriate authorities while Madison's campaign was still active and collecting donations. The GoFundMe fraud reporting process was more thorough than I had expected. The platform required detailed documentation, including screenshots of the fraudulent content, evidence that the stories were stolen, and proof of my identity as the original source of the misappropriated information. I uploaded everything Jake and I had compiled the night before, along with a detailed written statement explaining how Madison had gathered private information from family conversations and support group sessions. The customer service representative I spoke with, David Chen, explained that GoFundMe takes fraud reports seriously, but that investigations can take several days to complete. During that time, the campaign would remain active unless they found immediate evidence of clear violations. He assured me that if the fraud was confirmed, all donors would be refunded, and Madison's account would be permanently banned from the platform. "How many similar cases do you see?" I asked, curious about whether Madison's scheme was unusual or part of a larger pattern of medical fundraising fraud. "More than you might think," David admitted. "Medical crowdfunding has unfortunately become a target for scammers because people are naturally sympathetic to health-related hardships. We've seen everything from fake cancer diagnoses to fabricated accidents. Your case is particularly concerning because of the stolen personal details and the violation of a support group's confidentiality agreement."
The police report required a trip to the Philadelphia Police Department's Central Detective Division on North Broad Street. Detective Lisa Morales, who specialized in internet fraud cases, listened to my account with the professional attention of someone who had seen similar schemes before. "The challenge with online fraud is jurisdictional," she explained after reviewing my documentation. "The perpetrator is in Philadelphia, but the victims are scattered across multiple states and possibly countries. We'll need to coordinate with federal authorities if this case involves wire fraud across state lines."
Detective Morales was particularly interested in the evidence Jake and I had found suggesting Madison's previous campaigns. She explained that proving a pattern of fraud would strengthen any potential charges and help protect future victims. What you've done here, documenting everything systematically and preserving the evidence, is exactly what we need to build a strong case, she said. Many fraud victims don't think to save screenshots or create timelines, which makes prosecution much more difficult. She gave me a case number and explained that the investigation would likely take several weeks to complete. In the meantime, she recommended that I avoid confronting Madison directly, as this might prompt her to delete evidence or flee before charges could be filed. "What about my brother-in-law?" I asked. "He's planning to propose to her. Doesn't he have a right to know what she's been doing?" "That's a personal decision, not a legal one," Detective Morales said carefully. "But I would suggest being very cautious about how and when you share this information. If Miss Harper realizes she's under investigation, she might take actions that complicate our case." The weight of carrying this secret knowledge felt enormous as I drove home from the police station. Ryan was planning his future with someone who was systematically defrauding people using stolen tragedy. Every day we delayed telling him was another day he grew more emotionally and financially invested in a relationship built on lies. But Detective Morales was right about the risks. If Madison suspected she was being investigated, she might delete her campaign, destroy evidence, or even target Jake and me with false accusations or retaliation. Her sophistication in manipulating online sympathy suggested she was capable of turning public opinion against us if she felt threatened. The emergency support group session that Saturday afternoon was unlike anything we had experienced in our months of meeting together. Dr. Martinez had arranged the chairs in our usual circle, but the atmosphere felt charged with anger and violation rather than the gentle, healing energy that typically characterized our gatherings. All 8 core members attended, along with 2 women who had recently joined the group. Dr. Martinez opened by explaining that one of our members had discovered a serious breach of our confidentiality agreement and asked me to share what I had found. I walked them through Madison's campaign systematically, reading excerpts from her posts that contained details from our group sessions. The room grew increasingly tense as I described how our stories had been repackaged and sold to strangers without our knowledge or consent. Angela, the lawyer who had lost twins, was the first to speak when I finished. "This is identity theft, invasion of privacy, and fraud. Whoever did this has committed multiple felonies." Carmen, the teacher from South Philly, was visibly shaking with anger. "She used my daughter's story, the full-term loss, the complications, the specific details I shared about the delivery. She turned my baby's death into fundraising content." Michelle, the librarian, pulled out her phone and began taking notes. "We need to document which stories were stolen from which members. I want to file my own police report." The conversation that followed was intense and emotional, but also empowering. These women who had been victimized by Madison's fraud were transforming their anger into action. Dr. Martinez guided the discussion toward practical steps, police reports, documentation, potential civil lawsuits, and increased security measures for future group sessions. Janet, the social worker, raised a concern that had been nagging at me since discovering the campaign. If this person was sophisticated enough to create this elaborate fraud, and if she's done similar things before, how many other support groups might she have infiltrated? How many other vulnerable women might she be targeting? It was a chilling thought. Madison's ability to quickly gather intimate details about my grief process and transform them into compelling fundraising content suggested she had refined her techniques through practice. Her knowledge of support group dynamics, medical terminology, and the specific language of pregnancy loss indicated she might have studied or infiltrated similar groups in other communities. I think we need to warn other grief counselors and support group facilitators in the area. If she's done this before, or if she tries to do it again, they should know what to look for. Dr. Martinez agreed to reach out to her professional network and share information about the privacy breach and Madison's tactics. She also promised to implement additional security measures for our group, including stricter verification procedures for new members and clearer documentation of our confidentiality agreements. As the meeting concluded, I felt the both weight of responsibility and the strength of community support. These women who had been victimized alongside me were choosing to fight back rather than remain silent.
Their courage reinforced my conviction that exposing Madison was the right choice, regardless of the personal consequences. The final step in our plan was waiting for me at 4 p.m., telling Ryan the truth about the woman he wanted to marry. Everything we had set in motion, the police investigation, the GoFundMe report, the support group's decision to pursue legal action, would soon become impossible to contain or control. Jake was already at La Colombe when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of someone preparing for a difficult conversation. Ryan walked in 5 minutes later, looking relaxed and happy in the way people do when they believe their life is exactly where it should be. That was about to change forever.
Ryan's face went through a series of expressions as I showed him the printed screenshots of Madison's GoFundMe campaign. Confusion first, then recognition of the familiar details, then disbelief, and finally a kind of devastation that was painful to witness. This is your story, he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the Saturday afternoon chatter at La Colombe. These are the details you shared about losing Sophia. Not just my story, I said gently. She's also using personal information from other women in my support group, private stories that were shared in confidence. Jake reached across the table and placed his hand on his brother's shoulder. Ryan, we need you to know that we didn't want to be the ones telling you this, but there's more you need to understand about what Madison has been doing. I walked Ryan through the evidence we had gathered, showing him the timeline that demonstrated how Madison had systematically collected information from family conversations and transformed it into fundraising content. I explained about the previous campaigns we had discovered, the pattern of fraud that suggested this wasn't an isolated incident, and the police investigation that was now underway. Ryan listened in silence, occasionally asking questions that showed he was processing the information as an engineer would, methodically, looking for flaws in the logic or gaps in the evidence that might prove us wrong. The medical bills she mentioned, he said finally. She showed me paperwork from Jefferson Hospital, bills for emergency procedures, follow-up appointments, counseling services. Jake and I exchanged glances. We hadn't considered that Madison might have fabricated physical documentation to support her story. What kind of paperwork? I asked. Hospital invoices, insurance statements, appointment summaries. She said her insurance was fighting some of the charges related to the pregnancy loss. Ryan pulled out his phone and scrolled through his photo gallery. I took pictures of some of the documents because I was thinking about helping her pay the bills. I wanted to review them with my financial advisor. The documents Ryan showed us were sophisticated forgeries that looked completely authentic at first glance. Hospital letterhead, patient information, itemized charges for procedures that corresponded with pregnancy loss complications. But when I looked closer, using my experience as a hospital employee, several details didn't align with actual medical billing practices. The dates are wrong, I pointed out. This shows an emergency department visit on March 15th, but the follow-up appointment is listed as March 12th, 3 days before the supposed emergency. And this billing code doesn't exist. I work with these insurance codes every day. Ryan stared at the phone screen, his expression shifting from confused to horrified. She made fake medical bills? He asked. It looks that way, Jake said carefully, which means this fraud is even more elaborate than we initially thought. She didn't just steal emotional content for the fundraiser, she created an entire false paper trail to support her story. The implications of Madison's document forgery extended far beyond online fraud. If she was willing and able to create convincing fake medical records, what other aspects of her identity might be fabricated? Her employment history, her educational background, her family relationships? Everything Ryan thought he knew about the woman he planned to marry was now suspect. How long has she been lying to me? Ryan asked, his voice taking on an edge of anger that I recognized from childhood arguments between the brothers. We don't know, I admitted. But Ryan, there's something else you need to consider. She's been using your relationship as part of her credibility. The campaign mentions her partner Ryan several times, and she's posted photos of you together to make her story seem more authentic. This seemed to be the detail that broke through Ryan's remaining denial.
He had been inadvertently complicit in Madison's fraud, his genuine love and trust manipulated to lend credibility to her deception. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, running his hands through his hair in the same gesture Jake made when overwhelmed. "I introduced her to my coworkers, my friends, my family. Everyone thinks we're building a life together. Everyone thinks she lost a baby." "It's not your fault," Jake said firmly. "You couldn't have known she was capable of this level of deception." But Ryan was already spiraling into the kind of self-recrimination that comes with realizing you've been systematically manipulated by someone you trusted completely. "I should have seen the signs. The way she always had new dramatic stories, how she managed to make every conversation about herself, the inconsistencies and things she told me about her past." He looked up at us with eyes that had aged years in the past hour. What kind of person does this? What kind of person steals grief for money? I had been asking myself the same question since discovering Madison's campaign. The level of emotional manipulation required to sustain this kind of fraud suggested someone with profound psychological issues, or perhaps someone who viewed other people's pain as a resource to be exploited rather than an experience deserving empathy.
The police detective I spoke with said this type of fraud is becoming more common, I told Ryan. People who understand how to manipulate online sympathy and crowdfunding platforms. Madison isn't just stealing money, she's stealing trust from people who want to help others in crisis. Ryan's phone buzzed with a text message, and his face went pale as he read it. "It's Madison. She's asking if I want to grab dinner tonight and look at engagement rings online." He set the phone down on the table as if it had burned him. She's still planning our future while running this scam. The cruelty of the timing was almost breathtaking. Madison was actively defrauding people using stolen tragedy, while simultaneously planning a marriage based on lies and manipulation. The compartmentalization required to maintain both deceptions simultaneously suggested a level of calculated sociopathy that was chilling to consider. "What do I do?" Ryan asked, looking between Jake and me with the expression of someone whose entire reality had just collapsed. "Do I confront her? Do I pretend I don't know? Do I just disappear?" The detective advised us not to confront Madison directly until the investigation is complete. If she realizes she's been exposed, she might delete the campaign or destroy evidence. "But I can't keep pretending everything is normal," Ryan said. "I can't sit through dinner with her knowing what she's done. I can't look at engagement rings with someone who's been lying to me about everything." Jake leaned forward with the practical focus that made him a good architect. "You need to protect yourself financially and legally before you do anything else. Change your banking passwords, review any joint accounts or shared expenses, document anything valuable that belongs to you. If Madison is sophisticated enough to create fake medical records, she might be capable of identity theft or financial fraud too." The conversation continued for another hour as we helped Ryan process the immediate implications of Madison's deception. He would need to extract himself from the relationship without alerting her to the investigation. He would need to warn his family and friends about the fraud before they learned about it from news reports or legal proceedings. He would need to decide whether to cooperate with the police investigation or try to minimize his involvement. Most difficult of all, he would need to accept that the relationship he thought was leading to marriage had been built on systematic lies from someone who viewed his love as a tool for manipulation. As we prepared to leave the coffee shop, Ryan asked the question that had been underlying our entire conversation. "Do you think she ever actually cared about me, or was I just part of the scam from the beginning?" It was the kind of question that doesn't have a good answer. Madison's ability to maintain intimate deception over the course of a year-long relationship suggested either profound psychological damage or calculating sociopathy. Either way, Ryan's feelings and trust had been weapons used against him rather than emotions worthy of reciprocation. "I think you deserve someone who sees your love as a gift, not as an opportunity," I said finally. That evening, Jake and I sat in our apartment, processing the day's events and preparing for what we knew would be an escalating situation. Madison was still actively collecting donations from unsuspecting strangers. The police investigation was moving forward, but would take weeks to complete. The support group members were filing their own complaints and considering civil action.
and Ryan was now faced with extricating himself from a relationship that had been designed to exploit his trust and resources. My phone rang at 9:30 p.m. with a call from Detective Morales. "Miss White, we've been monitoring the GoFundMe campaign you reported, and there's been some concerning activity in the past few hours." My stomach dropped. "What kind of activity?" "Someone has been deleting comments and donor information from the campaign page. We're also seeing attempts to transfer funds from the platform to external accounts. It's possible that Miss Harper suspects she's under investigation." The implications were immediate and alarming. If Madison knew we had exposed her fraud, she might escalate her deception, retaliate against us, or disappear with the money she had already collected. The careful plans we had made to protect the investigation and gather evidence were potentially compromised. "What does this mean for the case?" I asked. "It means we need to move faster than we originally planned. Can you and your husband come to the station tomorrow morning? We may need to accelerate our timeline and take protective measures." As I hung up the phone, I realized we had entered the most dangerous phase of exposing Madison's fraud. She was no longer an unconscious perpetrator operating in secret. She was potentially a cornered criminal who knew she was being hunted.
Sunday morning brought an unexpected call from Michelle, the librarian from our support group. Her voice was tight with urgency when I answered the phone at 7:30 a.m. "Reese, you need to check the Philadelphia Inquirer's website immediately. There's an article about Madison, and it's not just about the GoFundMe fraud." I grabbed my laptop while Michelle stayed on the line, my hands shaking as I navigated to the newspaper's homepage. The headline made my blood run cold. "Local marketing executive under investigation for multiple charity fraud schemes dating back 5 years." The article, written by investigative journalist Sarah Chen, detailed a comprehensive investigation into Madison Harper's background that went far beyond what Jake and I had discovered. According to the reporting, Madison had operated at least 7 different fraudulent fundraising campaigns across multiple platforms and states, collecting over $75,000 from unsuspecting donors who believed they were supporting legitimate medical emergencies, family crises, and charitable causes. The article included interviews with previous victims who had been scammed by Madison's earlier schemes. A woman in Baltimore whose father's cancer story Madison had stolen for a 2021 fundraiser. A family in Richmond whose house fire tragedy had been appropriated for a fake emergency campaign. A military veteran in Norfolk whose PTSD treatment expenses had been used to create a fraudulent mental health awareness fundraiser. But the most shocking revelation was buried in the middle of the article. Madison Harper wasn't even her real name. According to court records uncovered by the Inquirer's investigation, the woman Ryan knew as Madison Harper was actually Amanda Sinclair, a 32-year-old from Wilmington, Delaware, who had been using false identities to conduct fraud schemes since 2019. She had previous convictions for identity theft and wire fraud in Delaware and Maryland, along with outstanding warrants in Virginia for similar charges. "This explains everything," Michelle said as I read through the article. "The sophistication of her operation, her ability to create convincing fake documents, her knowledge of how to manipulate online sympathy. She's been doing this professionally for years." I kept reading, discovering that Amanda/Madison had been investigated by federal authorities as part of a larger crackdown on charity fraud schemes that exploited social media and crowdfunding platforms. The FBI had been tracking her activities across multiple states, but she had evaded arrest by frequently changing identities, locations, and relationships. The article included a statement from FBI Special Agent Maria Rodriguez, who confirmed that Madison Harper was a person of interest in an ongoing federal investigation into organized charity fraud. Agent Rodriguez explained that the Philadelphia case had provided crucial evidence linking Amanda Sinclair's previous crimes to her current identity and operations. The victim who came forward in Philadelphia provided documentation that allowed us to connect multiple fraud schemes across state lines. Agent Rodriguez was quoted as saying, "This case represents a significant breakthrough in our investigation of organized charity fraud networks." I realized, with a mix of pride and terror, that the victim who came forward in Philadelphia was me. My decision to report Madison's fraud hadn't just exposed a single scam. It had provided the missing piece that federal investigators needed to build a comprehensive case against a serial fraudster who had been victimizing people for years. My phone rang again before I could fully process the implications of the article. This time it was Detective Morales. "Ms. White, I assume you've seen the news coverage.
We need you and your husband to come to the federal building downtown as soon as possible. The FBI is taking over this case, and they need to debrief you about your interactions with the suspect. The federal building at 600 Arch Street was an imposing structure that made the local police station feel welcoming by comparison. Special Agent Rodriguez met us in a sterile conference room equipped with recording devices and stacks of documents that represented years of investigation into Amanda Sinclair's criminal activities. Agent Rodriguez was a woman in her 40s with the kind of focused intensity that comes from hunting sophisticated criminals. She explained that the FBI had been tracking Amanda Sinclair since 2020, when her fraud schemes had evolved from simple online scams to elaborate long-term deceptions that involved creating false identities and infiltrating communities for months at a time. What made your case different was the systematic way you documented her methods. Most fraud victims realize they've been scammed after the money is gone and the perpetrator has disappeared. You caught her in the act and preserved evidence while she was still operating.
The briefing that followed revealed the true scope of Amanda's criminal enterprise. She had been using dating apps and social media to identify and cultivate relationships with emotionally vulnerable targets, particularly men who had recently experienced loss, trauma, or major life transitions. Ryan wasn't her first romantic mark. He was part of a pattern of exploitation that had victimized at least 12 other men across 5 states. Her method was sophisticated, Agent Rodriguez continued. She would spend months building genuine-seeming relationships while simultaneously gathering personal information that she could later use for fraud schemes. The pregnancy loss story wasn't random. She had been collecting details about reproductive trauma from multiple sources to create the most compelling possible fundraising narrative. Jake leaned forward in his chair, his architect's mind organizing the information into clear patterns. So Ryan was never actually her boyfriend? He was research for her next fraud operation? Based on our investigation, that appears to be correct. She targeted your brother specifically because his family had recently experienced a pregnancy loss, which gave her access to authentic emotional details and a built-in network of potential donors who would be sympathetic to similar stories. The coldness of Amanda's calculation was breathtaking. She hadn't just stolen my grief, she had engineered an entire relationship with Ryan to gain access to our family's tragedy. Every family dinner, every conversation about our loss, every moment of sympathy she had expressed had been data collection for her next fraud scheme. What about the other women in my support group? I asked. How did she get access to their stories? Agent Rodriguez pulled out a thick file folder and spread several surveillance photos across the table. The images showed Amanda/Madison in various locations around Philadelphia, sitting in cars outside Harbor Light Community Center on Thursday evenings, following women from our support group to their homes and workplaces, even photographing license plates in the community center parking lot. She had been conducting surveillance on your support group for at least 2 months before launching the GoFundMe campaign, Agent Rodriguez explained. We believe she used the information your brother-in-law provided about your attendance at grief counseling to identify and target the entire group. The realization that Amanda had been stalking vulnerable women who were processing traumatic loss added a layer of violation that went beyond financial fraud. She had turned our healing space into a hunting ground, our shared pain into market research for her criminal enterprise. Is she dangerous? I asked, thinking about Ryan's plan to extract himself from the relationship without alerting her to the investigation. Amanda Sinclair has no history of physical violence, but she has demonstrated escalating sophistication in her fraud schemes and has shown willingness to retaliate against people who threaten her operations, Agent Rodriguez said carefully. We're particularly concerned about your brother-in-law's safety since he's been living with her and has access to information that could compromise our investigation. The meeting continued for 3 hours as Agent Rodriguez walked us through the evidence the FBI had gathered and explained how our case fit into their larger investigation. They had been building a federal prosecution that would charge Amanda with wire fraud,
identity theft, money laundering, and conspiracy charges that could result in decades in prison. But they needed our continued cooperation to maintain the investigation without alerting Amanda to the scope of the case against her. The challenge is timing, Agent Rodriguez explained. We want to arrest her while she's still actively operating the current fraud scheme, which provides the strongest evidence for prosecution. But we also need to protect your brother-in-law and prevent her from destroying evidence or fleeing. Jake and I exchanged glances, understanding that we were being asked to help orchestrate a federal investigation that would determine whether Amanda faced justice for years of victimizing vulnerable people. "What do you need us to do?" I asked. Agent Rodriguez smiled for the first time since we had met her. "We need you to help us catch her in the act of committing fraud, and we think we know exactly how to do it." The plan she outlined was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. The FBI wanted to use Ryan as an unwitting cooperator to gather evidence of Amanda's current fraud activities while simultaneously protecting him from potential retaliation. They would wire Ryan's apartment and monitor his interactions with Amanda, documenting her admissions about the fraud scheme while building evidence for federal prosecution. But the plan required Ryan to continue his relationship with Amanda for at least another week, pretending he knew nothing about her true identity, while federal agents gathered the evidence they needed to ensure her conviction. "Can he do it?" Agent Rodriguez asked. "Can your brother-in-law maintain a relationship with someone he knows is a serial fraudster long enough for us to build an airtight case?" I thought about Ryan's devastation the day before, his horror at learning that his entire relationship had been built on lies and manipulation. The psychological challenge of pretending normalcy with someone who had systematically exploited his trust seemed almost cruel. But I also thought about the other victims. The Baltimore woman whose father's cancer story had been stolen, the Richmond family whose house fire had been appropriated, the military veteran whose PTSD had been commodified for profit. The breakthrough had revealed the true scope of Amanda's crimes and given us the opportunity to stop her permanently. Now we had to decide whether we were willing to risk everything to ensure she never victimized anyone else again.
Ryan's apartment had been transformed into a federal surveillance operation by Tuesday evening. FBI technicians had installed hidden cameras in the living room and kitchen, along with audio recording equipment that could capture conversations from anywhere in the space. Agent Rodriguez briefed Ryan on the operation from a command center set up in an unmarked van parked 3 blocks away. "Remember, you don't need to ask leading questions or try to get her to confess." Agent Rodriguez's voice came through the nearly invisible earpiece Ryan wore. "Just act normal and let her talk. We're particularly interested in documenting any admissions about the fundraising campaign, her use of false identity documents, or references to previous fraud schemes." I watched the surveillance feeds from the FBI field office downtown, my stomach churning as I saw Ryan prepare for what might be the most difficult performance of his life. He had to pretend everything was normal with a woman he now knew was a serial criminal who had been manipulating him for over a year. Amanda arrived at 7 p.m. carrying takeout from the Vietnamese restaurant they frequented, acting exactly like the loving girlfriend she had pretended to be for months. Through the hidden cameras, I could see her kiss Ryan hello, ask about his day at work, and discuss weekend plans with the casual intimacy of someone who believed her deception was still intact. "The cognitive dissonance must be incredible for him," said Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the FBI's behavioral analyst who was monitoring the operation alongside Agent Rodriguez and me. "He has to interact normally with someone he knows has been systematically lying to him about everything." The first breakthrough came during dinner, when Amanda casually mentioned that she had received several large donations to her GoFundMe campaign that day.
"This woman in Seattle sent $500, Amanda said, scrolling through her phone while eating spring rolls. "She lost a baby at 24 weeks and said my story really resonated with her. It's amazing how people connect over shared trauma." The callousness of her statement was breathtaking. Amanda was describing the exploitation of another woman's genuine grief as if it were a successful marketing strategy. She showed no awareness that she was profiting from authentic tragedy or that her victims were real people experiencing real pain. Ryan managed to respond with appropriate interest, asking questions about the campaign's progress and the donors' responses. His performance was convincing enough that Amanda began sharing details about her fraud operation that went far beyond what we had discovered independently. "The secret is authenticity," she explained, apparently proud of her expertise in manipulation. "People can tell when grief stories feel manufactured or generic. You need specific details, medical terminology, exact dates, and procedures. The more precise you are about the loss, the more credible the story becomes." She went on to describe how she had researched pregnancy loss support groups online to understand the language and experiences of women who had actually endured such tragedies. She had studied medical billing practices to create convincing fake invoices. She had even researched the specific hospitals and doctors in Philadelphia to ensure her story aligned with local medical resources. "The hardest part is maintaining emotional consistency," Amanda continued, seemingly unaware that she was confessing to federal crimes while being recorded. "You have to remember which version of the story you told to which people, especially when you're dealing with family members who might compare notes." Dr. Walsh leaned forward in her chair, taking notes on Amanda's admissions. "She's describing sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques. This isn't impulsive criminal behavior. It's a carefully developed skill set for exploiting human empathy." The surveillance continued for 3 days, with Amanda unknowingly documenting her own criminal enterprise while believing she was having normal conversations with her boyfriend. She discussed previous fraud schemes as if they were legitimate fundraising efforts, described other victims by their first names and the tragedies she had stolen from them, and even showed Ryan fake documents she was preparing for her next potential campaign. On Thursday evening, Amanda made the admission that sealed her fate. "I've been thinking about expanding into medical crowdfunding for children's illnesses," she told Ryan while they watched Netflix on his couch. "Pediatric cancer stories perform really well online because people feel extra sympathy for sick kids and their families. I've been researching Children's Hospital of Philadelphia to understand the treatment protocols and billing practices."
The implication was clear. Amanda was planning to exploit sick children and their families for her next fraud scheme. She was researching my workplace, potentially targeting the pediatric patients and families I worked with every day. "That's enough," Agent Rodriguez said through the surveillance feed. "We're moving tomorrow." The arrest operation was scheduled for Friday morning, when Amanda would be leaving Ryan's apartment to go to her supposed marketing job. FBI agents had confirmed that she was actually unemployed and had been using a fake office building as her supposed workplace whenever Ryan asked about her professional activities. Ryan's role in the operation concluded Thursday night after Amanda fell asleep. FBI technicians quietly removed the surveillance equipment while she was unconscious, and Ryan left early Friday morning under the pretense of a work emergency, knowing he would never see Amanda again as a free person. At 8:47 a.m. on Friday, July 28th, FBI agents arrested Amanda Sinclair outside Ryan's apartment building as she walked to her car. The arrest was captured by news crews who had been alerted by Agent Rodriguez to ensure public awareness of Amanda's crimes and to encourage other potential victims to come forward. I watched the arrest coverage from the hospital break room during my lunch shift, feeling a complex mixture of relief, vindication, and exhaustion. The woman who had stolen my daughter's story and violated my support group's trust was finally facing justice for her crimes. But the transformation went beyond just Amanda's arrest. The investigation had revealed patterns of vulnerability in online fundraising systems, support group privacy protocols, and background checking procedures that needed to be addressed to protect future victims.
GoFundMe announced new verification procedures for medical fundraising campaigns, requiring additional documentation and identity confirmation before campaigns could go live. Harbor Light Community Center implemented enhanced security measures for all support groups, including background checks for new members and stricter confidentiality agreements. The Philadelphia Inquirer's investigation sparked a broader conversation about charity fraud and the need for better protection of vulnerable people who sought help through crowdfunding platforms. Other news outlets picked up the story, interviewing additional victims of Amanda's schemes and highlighting the sophisticated methods used by modern fraud operations. My support group underwent its own transformation during this process. What had started as individual healing had evolved into collective action and advocacy. We had discovered that our shared vulnerability could become shared strength when we chose to fight back against exploitation rather than suffer in silence. Dr. Martinez organized a special session 2 weeks after Amanda's arrest where we processed the experience of having our privacy violated and our stories stolen. But instead of focusing solely on the trauma of victimization, we discussed how our decision to pursue justice had prevented Amanda from exploiting other vulnerable people. What you did required tremendous courage, Dr. Martinez told us during that session. You transformed your own violation into protection for others. That's the kind of healing that extends beyond personal recovery. Michelle had researched Amanda's other victims and discovered that our case was the first time any of them had reported her crimes to authorities. Previous victims had either not realized they were being scammed until after Amanda disappeared or had been too embarrassed or overwhelmed to pursue justice. We broke the cycle, Angela said during the session. She was able to keep victimizing people because no one had ever held her accountable before. The legal proceedings moved quickly once Amanda was arrested. Faced with overwhelming evidence from the FBI surveillance operation and documentation from multiple victims across several states, she accepted a plea agreement that sentenced her to 8 years in federal prison and required her to pay full restitution to all victims of her fraud schemes. The $8,247 she had collected through the fake pregnancy loss campaign was returned to donors through GoFundMe's guarantee program. But more importantly, the investigation had identified and contacted victims of her previous schemes, many of whom had never recovered the money they had donated to what they believed were legitimate emergencies. Ryan attended Amanda's sentencing hearing not to show support for the woman who had manipulated him, but to provide victim impact testimony about the psychological damage caused by her elaborate deception. She didn't just steal money. She stole trust. She stole grief. She stole the sacred space where people process their most difficult experiences. She turned human compassion into a commodity and human tragedy into performance art. The transformation was complete. A discovery that had started with a random Facebook post had evolved into a federal investigation that ended a years-long criminal enterprise. Amanda's victims had found justice, her future victims had been protected, and the systems that she had exploited were being strengthened to prevent similar fraud. But perhaps the most significant transformation was personal. I had learned that vulnerability and strength weren't opposites. They could coexist and even enhance each other. The grief that had made me susceptible to Amanda's exploitation had also given me the insight to recognize her deception and the courage to stop her. The woman who had tried to steal my daughter's story had inadvertently taught me that some stories are worth fighting for and some fights are worth winning, regardless of the personal cost. 6 months after Amanda Sinclair's sentencing, I stood in the same basement meeting room at Harbor Light Community Center where this entire journey had begun. But everything had changed, starting with the bronze plaque mounted beside the door that read, "The Sophia Rose Memorial Room for Reproductive Grief Support." The room had been renamed and renovated using funds from a legitimate fundraising campaign organized by our support group members. What had once been a simple circle of folding chairs was now a comfortable space with proper seating, soft lighting, and a small memorial wall where members could display photos or mementos of the children they had lost. Dr. Martinez stood at the front of the room, addressing a group of 30 grief counselors and support group facilitators from across the Delaware Valley. They had gathered for a training session on privacy protection and fraud prevention that had grown out of our experience with Amanda's deception. The Sinclair case taught us that vulnerability and transparency don't have to mean exposure to exploitation, Dr. Martinez explained to the assembled professionals. We can create sacred healing spaces while still implementing security measures that protect our members from predators who view grief as a business opportunity. I was scheduled to speak after Dr. Martinez, sharing our story as a case study in how support communities could respond to privacy violations and fraud attempts. But first, I wanted to absorb the transformation that had occurred in this space that had been so central to my healing journey. The memorial wall drew my attention, as it always did. Sophia's photo occupied a small frame next to pictures of other children whose lives had been brief but meaningful. But now her image was surrounded by symbols of justice and protection rather than just grief and loss. The legal victory against Amanda had transformed Sophia's memory from a stolen commodity back into a cherished legacy. Angela approached me before the session began, carrying a folder thick with documentation that had become familiar over the past months. The restitution payments started arriving this week, she said, her lawyer's efficiency evident in how she had organized the financial recovery process for Amanda's victims. 47 people across 5 states are getting their money back, plus interest. But more importantly, 12 families who didn't even know they had been scammed are finally getting closure. The restitution process had revealed the true scope of Amanda's impact on her victims. Many people who had donated to her various campaigns had never realized they had been defrauded, believing their money had genuinely helped families in crisis. Learning that their compassion had been exploited was traumatic, but it also provided an opportunity for healing and prevention education. Carmen joined our conversation, bringing news from her work as a high school teacher in South Philadelphia. I've been incorporating online safety and fraud awareness into my curriculum. These kids are growing up with crowdfunding and social media fundraising as normal parts of life, but nobody's teaching them how to identify sophisticated scams. Amanda's case gives me concrete examples of how emotional manipulation works. The ripple effects of our case had extended far beyond the immediate victims. Educational institutions, nonprofit organizations, and online platforms had all implemented new policies and training programs based on lessons learned from Amanda's fraud schemes. Michelle had become something of an expert on digital privacy protection, consulting with libraries and community organizations about safeguarding personal information in online support communities. The technology exists to protect people's stories while still allowing them to share and heal together. It just requires intentional implementation and ongoing vigilance. Amanda succeeded because nobody was watching for the kind of sophisticated long-term infiltration she was conducting. As the training session began, I found myself reflecting on how different my understanding of vulnerability and strength had become over the past year. When I first started attending meetings in this room, I had viewed my grief as a private burden that needed to be carefully contained and gradually overcome. Amanda's violation had initially made me feel even more exposed and damaged. But the process of fighting back had revealed that shared vulnerability could become collective power when people chose cooperation over isolation. Our support group hadn't become weaker after being victimized. We had become a force for protecting others from similar exploitation. When my time came to address the group of counselors and facilitators, I spoke about the practical lessons we had learned while also acknowledging the emotional complexity of turning personal trauma into public advocacy.
The hardest part wasn't discovering that someone had stolen my daughter's story, I told the audience. The hardest part was deciding whether fighting back was worth the risk of additional exposure and pain. But silence would have meant Amanda could continue victimizing other families, other support groups, other vulnerable people seeking help during their darkest moments. I shared the specific security measures our group had implemented: enhanced background checking for new members, confidentiality agreements with legal consequences for violations, and protocols for reporting suspicious behavior or privacy breaches. But I also emphasized that protection couldn't come at the expense of authentic healing and genuine connection. The goal isn't to make support communities paranoid or closed off, I explained. The goal is to create informed awareness that allows people to share their experiences safely while recognizing when their trust is being exploited. During the question and answer session, a facilitator from Camden asked about the psychological impact of discovering that grief had been commodified for profit. How do you help people process the violation of having their most painful experiences turned into someone else's business model? It was a question I had been asked many times over the past months, and one that didn't have a simple answer. I think the key is recognizing that the violation doesn't diminish the authenticity or value of the original experience, I said. Amanda stole my words about losing Sophia, but she couldn't steal my actual relationship with my daughter or the genuine healing I found in this community. The theft was real, but it was separate from the original love and loss that inspired those words. After the training session concluded, Jake and I drove to Jefferson Hospital for our appointment with Dr. Patricia Moreau, the physician who had delivered the devastating news about Sophia's loss a year earlier. But this wasn't a grief counseling session or a medical consultation. Dr. Moreau had asked us to participate in a research study about online fraud targeting families experiencing pregnancy loss. Your case has prompted us to examine how medical information and patient experiences are being exploited by scammers, Dr. Moreau explained as we sat in her office. We're developing protocols to help healthcare providers identify and report potential fraud schemes that target their patients or use medical scenarios for illegal fundraising. The research study involved reviewing Amanda's fake medical documents and providing feedback on what healthcare professionals should look out for when patients report unusual fundraising requests or suspicious online campaigns related to medical care. Amanda's forgeries were sophisticated, but there were several medical inconsistencies that trained personnel should have been able to identify, Dr. Moreau noted. We want to create educational materials that help doctors, nurses, and administrative staff recognize when medical scenarios are being fabricated for fraud purposes. Participating in the research study felt like another step in transforming our personal experience into broader protection for other families. The medical details Amanda had stolen from our case were being used to prevent future exploitation of patients and their families. That evening, Jake and I attended the monthly dinner at Jake's parents' house in Manayunk, the first family gathering since Amanda's sentencing where the conversation wasn't dominated by legal proceedings and court dates. Ryan had been rebuilding his life slowly and deliberately over the past months. He had moved to a new apartment, started therapy to process the psychological impact of the long-term deception, and begun dating someone he had met through a hiking group rather than online platforms. I'm learning to trust my instincts again, Ryan told us over dessert. Amanda was so good at manipulation that I started doubting my own judgment about everything. Therapy is helping me understand that being fooled by a professional criminal doesn't mean I'm gullible or naive. Jake's parents had also processed their own feelings about welcoming someone into their family who had been systematically deceiving everyone around her. They had felt guilty about not recognizing Amanda's deception, angry about being manipulated, and worried about Ryan's emotional recovery. The hardest part was realizing that our desire to be welcoming and inclusive made us vulnerable to someone who saw our kindness as weakness, Jake's mother said. But the alternative, being suspicious and closed off to new people, isn't who we want to be either. As we drove home that night, Jake and I talked about the strange completeness of our journey from victims to advocates to educators. The case that had started with a random Facebook notification had evolved into a comprehensive transformation of how we understood privacy, community, vulnerability, and justice. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't seen that sponsored post? Jake asked as we pulled into our Fishtown neighborhood. I considered the question seriously. Without that accidental discovery, Amanda would have continued her fraud indefinitely, victimizing more families and support groups while building increasingly sophisticated deception schemes. The ripple effects of our case, the policy changes, the educational programs, and the protection for other victims would never have occurred. I think Sophia's story was always going to be part of something bigger than our personal loss. Amanda tried to steal it for profit, but we got to reclaim it for protection and prevention. Maybe that's what was supposed to happen all along. The new reality we inhabited was more complex, but also more meaningful than the life we had lived before Amanda's deception. We had learned that healing doesn't always mean returning to previous innocence. Sometimes it means integrating difficult knowledge into a stronger, more aware version of yourself. Sophia's memory was no longer just private grief. It had become a shield protecting other families from exploitation and a bridge connecting our personal loss to broader social justice. The daughter we couldn't save had become part of saving others. In the end, Amanda Sinclair had taught us something she never intended, that the power to transform pain into protection is stronger than any scheme to transform tragedy into profit. That lesson would outlast her fraud, outlast her prison sentence, and outlast our own grief. Some stories are worth stealing, but some stories fight back.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.